preparing to live stream the meeting. It's still loading.
I got a note saying it's live streaming.
Here we are.
Great.
All right.
Okay. Except I am frozen. Oh, there's just the delay. It also flipped my camera. Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Fiction and the Radical Imagination. It's still loading for you. I think we're live.
We might be live.
Mine says live.
Okay, so I am going to
Do you know where it's live? Because it doesn't look like it's the YouTube link from before.
Oh, the one that we're tweeting?
Right.
no, let's see if I can get the
Copy
link.
the streaming link.
I think
Yeah, if you get a streaming link and email it.
Streaming link.
Oh yeah, I see. Okay. So we should all tweet that? Is that the idea?
yeah, do you see it now?
Hold on, let me get chat going. Yes. And I'll just say starting now with this link if they will let me copy and paste. Yeah. Okay.
I think
Yeah, if you get a streaming link and email it.
Streaming link. I just sent it in the
Oh yeah, I
chat.
see. Okay. So we should all tweet that? Is that the idea?
yeah, do you see it now?
I tweeted the one I just got.
Let me get chat going.
And it is streaming live right now.
And I'll just say starting now with this link. That's what I just did. Yeah, starting now.
So Margaret, I think we need your earbuds. I think we're now getting
Okay.
the delay.
It is streaming. It's there. We all look great.
Yay.
Okay, thank you all for joining us for Fiction and the Radical Imagination. I'm going to do some introduction. We have with us David Bowles, who is a Mexican-American author from South Texas, where he teaches at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. He has written over 20 books, most notably The Smoking Mirror and They Call Me Güero. This summer, HarperCollins will launch his 13th Street series, pitched as a Latinx Stranger Things for kids ages 5 to 10. And in the fall, his graphic novels, Rise of the Halfling King and Clockwork, Curandera, The Witch Owl Parliament will be released. David's work has also been published in multiple anthologies, plus venues such as the School Library Journal, Apex, Strange Horizons, Rattle, Translation Review, and the Journal of Children's Literature. In 2017, David was inducted into the Texas Institute of Letters. You can find him at davidbowles.us. Tananarive is an award-winning author who teaches Black horror and Afrofuturism at UCLA. She is an executive producer on Shudder's groundbreaking documentary Horror Noir, A History of Black Horror. A leading voice in Black speculative fiction for more than 20 years, Dew has won an American Book Award, an NAACP Image Award, and a British Fantasy Award. And her writing has been included in Best of the Year anthologies. Her books include Ghost Summer, Stories, My Soul to Keep, and The Good House. She and her late mother, civil rights activist Patricia Stevens Dew, co-authored Freedom in the Family, a mother-daughter memoir for the fight for civil rights. She is married to author Stephen Barnes, with whom she collaborates on screenplays. You can find out more from her at tananarivedew.com. Next, we have Gabino Iglesias, who is a writer, editor, journalist, and book reviewer living in Austin, Texas. He is the author of Coyote Songs, Zero Saints, both from Broken River Books and Gutmouth from Eraserhead Press. He is the book reviewers editor at Pank Magazine, TV film editor at Entropy Magazine, and a columnist for Lit Reactor and Clash Media. His nonfiction has appeared in places like the New York Times, Los Angeles Review of Books, LA Times, El Nuevo Dia, and other venues. The stuff that's made up has been published in places like Red Fez, Flash Fiction Offensive, Drunk Monkeys, Bizarro Central, Paragraph Line, Divergent Magazine, Cease, Cows, and many horror, crime, surrealist, and bizarro anthologies. You can find him on Twitter at Gabino_Iglesias. Walidah Imarisha is an educator, writer, public scholar, and poet. She is the co-editor of 2 anthologies, including Octavia's Brood, science fiction stories from social justice movements. Imarisha is also author of Angels with Dirty Faces, 3 stories of crime, prison, and redemption, which won a 2017 Oregon Book Award, and a poetry collection, Scars/Stars. In 2015, she received a Tiptree Fellowship for her science fiction writing. Imarisha has taught in Stanford University's program of Writing and Rhetoric, Pacific Northwest College of the Arts MFA in Creative Writing, and Masters in Creative Studies, Portland State University's Black Studies Department, and Oregon State University's Women's, Gender, Sexuality Studies Department. You can find out more about her at walidah.com. And next is Margaret Killjoy, a trans feminine author and editor currently living in a self-built cabin in the Appalachian Mountains. She is author of the Daniel Kane series of novellas published by Tor.com. The first book, The Lamb Will Slaughter the Lion, was released in 2017, and its sequel, The Barrow Will Send What It May, came out in April 2018. Her work primarily deals with themes of power and anarchism, as well as gender, social transformation, and people living itinerant or criminal lifestyles. Margaret's website is birdsbeforethestorm.net. And I'm the moderator, T. Thorn Coyle. I'm a novelist, activist. I've written several series, The Witches of Portland, The Panther Chronicles, and my new post-apocalyptic epic fantasy series, The Steel Clan Saga. Book 1 is up for pre-order right now, and that is We Seek No Kings. And you can find me at thorncoyle.com. All right. Thanks, everyone, for putting up with our technical difficulties. And here we are with starting off with the questions. Let's all take a breath together.
Whew, need that.
All right. So I'd like to start, and I'd like to start with you, David, if you will. What radical fiction has helped shape your imagination?
Well, when I think of that question, I think of the radical fiction that shaped me when I was younger. As a queer Chicano growing up on the borderlands in a place where just mentioning any kind of interest in people of the same gender could get you in a lot of trouble. It was really, really tough as a teenager. And so one of the places that I would go to was literature, and I was a big science fiction fan. And so the work of people like Ursula K. Le Guin, Samuel Delany, even a lot of Octavia Butler's work and the way it kind of interrogated human sexuality and gender roles and so forth helped me to see like a radical possible future for people like me who were kind of like living beneath the radar. I'm bisexual, so I was able to like pass much the way being a light-skinned Chicano meant that I could pass for white. And there was a lot of that kind of, really, really difficult grappling with identity as a teenager that, books like this helped me to grapple with. And I found Kathy Acker's work and Poppy Z. Bright also were authors whose kind of like a radical understanding of identity really shaped the way I thought about it, both as an individual and as a writer. And then I came across, the increasingly growing corpus of Chicano writers, and High Aztec by Ernest Hogan was really, really influential in helping me to see that all of this kind of playing with radical notions of gender identity and cultural identity and futurisms that were that gave that made a space for me other than the kind of Nepantla in which I live. Nepantla being a term coined by Gloria Ansaldúa, the Chicana philosopher, who also came from the same region that I do. In fact, her family lives just up the road from where I am right now. And she talked about Nepantla. This is a Nahuatl term, an Aztec term that means the in-between place. And the idea that that in-between place of identity in which I found myself could exist in the future in a viable, vibrant, beautiful way was exciting. And it was in this kind of like early radical fiction, 60s, 70s, 80s, that I found a place for myself and a voice and a way to think about my role as a writer as well as an aspiring writer. What could I do? What could I write into being? So, you know, that's usually where I start when I think about radical fiction, is what shaped me. And now there's just so much amazing stuff out there, and I'm lucky to be friends with a lot of people who write really amazing radical fiction. Just one example would be Anna Marie McLemore, who's fantastic retoolings of fairy tales and legends through an LGBTQ lens, just really resonate with me and do radical things for YA fiction that a young teenage David Bowles would have really benefited from. Thanks.
Thank you. Tananarive, do you want to jump in on this question?
Yes. Wow. Yes, taking me back to childhood with that. So thank you for that. For me, I first want to start with a definition of what radical fiction would mean to me as a young reader, which has everything to do with inclusion, because it is so devastating, as you were mentioning, to have been erased in fiction, and despite all my parents' best efforts. So yes, I'm reading Virginia Hamilton. Yes, we have like Black history lessons at home and Black history comic books. But even despite all that, by the time I got to college, I was writing white characters. You know, I started out writing Black characters and about magic and talking cats and getting in the Book of Walidah. So it's all imagination and all Black imagination and Black girl magic. But by the time I'd had high school and was exposed to the canon, the picture in my mind of a literary short story was a white woman having a crisis, right? And that was what I was writing. And how will I resolve this? You know, so the magic was gone and the Blackness was gone. So for me, it was sort of a radical thing to even imagine myself inside this kind of fiction, because I was reading Stephen King, but I wasn't thinking of myself as someone who could write what he wrote. So I would have to say Gloria Naylor's Mama Day was a really groundbreaking read for me, because it was really the first time I could see myself as a Black woman artist, also knitting together the metaphysical piece and writing something that my mom and dad could be proud of, right? Because I was raised by two civil rights activists, and I felt very lucky that they were even tolerating the idea that I wanted to be an artist, and they were very supportive of that. Because that's not to be taken for granted. Both of my sisters went to law school, and I tried a law class and was bored to tears. And I was like, oh, I think I might have to do this writing thing after all. So I did, however, feel a sense of responsibility that whatever I wrote should have weight and value. And because of genre bias, again, through college, I was being pushed away, not only from myself and my skin, but from genre, right? So although I didn't discover Octavia until I was midway through writing my second novel, I will also call out Octavia Butler's name in terms of that legitimizing voice and presence to show me that it is possible to enact change or suggest change, to show reality through a funhouse mirror, a prism of speculation that takes us out of the everyday into the fantastic, where ironically we can sometimes see the everyday better from the realm of the fantastic. So I'm going to call out Gloria Naylor and Octavia Butler there, because for a Black woman writer, it is literally radical just to exist in fiction to exist in canon.
Thank you. Margaret, did you want to speak to the question?
First, I have to unmute myself. Well, so when I was thinking about what radical fiction means to me, I was thinking about how right now I wish I was living in one of my favorite radical fiction books, The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin. But instead, I feel like I'm living in The Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler, which is maybe the most prescient novel that's ever been written. I have a hard time coming up with anything else that, that book literally includes a right-wing fundamentalist who runs on the platform Make America Great Again, and a slow, terrible apocalypse, but hopeful. And there needs to be some hope there doesn't need to be, but I prefer books with some hope, especially because radical fiction to me is fiction that gets across radical ideas, and we're all fucked isn't a very original or radical idea, it's maybe true, I don't know, I hope not, but but from thinking about what the rest of you all were saying, in terms of radical fiction that shaped who I am, it's hard because I didn't read a lot of radical fiction when I was a kid. In some ways, I read radical fiction that was terribly opposed to my current beliefs. I read a lot of Heinlein as a kid, and Heinlein he's very complicated, but he's not exactly who I would put on a pedestal right now. I think instead I found myself through zine culture and through self-published DIY stories, a lot of which were memoir, but a lot of the memoir was maybe fake, but it was all very narrative. And so I found that zine culture was my first real introduction to radical fiction, because I didn't start reading more radical science fiction until a little bit later. And I actually did a really similar thing. I used to always write cis women as my self-insert character whenever I wanted to write a character who was, the person I wish I was. I would always write cis women, and it's only been the past few years that I've really been able to let myself write trans women, because we don't exist in fiction to any appreciable degree. And then I guess if there's other radical fiction that I really want to shout out, it's actually Octavia's Brood by Walidah, because the very form of it is really radical. It really made me think about how writing is this very solitary act, but changing the world is very collective act. It has to be, otherwise it's terrible. And so the idea of creating a collection of short stories that activists write, that then really good authors help the activists tell those stories, the act of helping people tell their own stories is incredibly radical. And I really like that book because of it. And then maybe in terms of the happy book that I would show to someone to be like, this is what society could be. I haven't read this in about 15 years, so I might not pass my current test, but The Fifth Sacred Thing by Starhawk was incredibly influential on 19-year-old me, and really opened my eyes to what fiction can do in terms of utopianism. And I'm very interested in utopian fiction.
Thank you. Gabino?
Funny story. So you sent that email with the little questions in blue, and I kind of cracked my head for a couple hours. First, because everything that came to mind was nonfiction. So I try to force myself to think about fiction, and then everything that came to me from my reading of fiction was more radical in the sense of who was writing it than what they were writing. So it was figures like J.F. Gonzalez, because he was, that brown dude that could write horror, or Linda Addison, because she's an amazing poet, but it was that figure, the Black woman who went on to win, I don't know how many Bram Stoker awards. So I had to push back and keep going back to my childhood. And I realized it wasn't fiction, it was poetry, strangely enough. And he was a Puerto Rican poet, Julia de Burgos. And she died in Harlem in 1953, drunk in a gutter. Horrible story. But the point was, I grew up reading whatever I could get my hands on. Growing up, 25 years, born and raised in the Caribbean, I didn't have the access to books that I started having when I moved to the States. So for me, it was a matter of what's available. So what was available? Jules Verne, to James Patterson. So it was kind of like that, either European or American white men writing, and that's the people who wrote books. I knew that black and brown kids, we could play sports and we could do music, but writing was not an option because we just don't do that. We're not allowed to. And discovering Julia was sort of, here's a radical feminist born in 1914, disenchanted, writing about powerlessness, trying to write about the body at that time, and basically living the life of the type of life that Bukowski represents in his poetry years later. And reading her sort of changed the way that I looked at fiction, because if she could do it, it didn't only mean that I could do it, it meant that if I wanted to tell my story, I had to do it. Hopefully I was going to be able to do it in a way that didn't mean dying in a gutter in Harlem, but it gave me the strength to try. So what, her poetry was super radical for the time, but yeah, strangely enough, it wasn't necessarily fiction. It was Julia Burgos's poetry, all the way until I moved to the States and discovered folks like Octavia Butler and Linda Addison, and when I started at UT, Gloria Saldúa, and the rest of those folks. So yeah, strangely enough, it started with poetry.
Thank you. Walidah?
I'm like, it always starts with poetry. The great thing about going last is I can just be like, yes. Like if we were in person, I'd be snapping, but I can't do, I guess I could just mutely be doing this. If you see me doing that, that's what I'm doing. But there's, everyone, so much brilliance. Actually, this is my fiction section. And when I've been doing a lot of Zoom, it's always behind me because it's got my back. Because, I think fiction to me is so important. But I think just listening to everyone talk, also just what I was thinking about is that act of storytelling. And that's what's radical. And it's not necessarily, Gabino, as you were saying, the form, right? It could be poetry, it could be fiction, it could be nonfiction, it could be some multimedia, genre crossing creation, but it's that act of telling stories that are true and that have the ability to change individuals and the world. And so that to me is sort of where I root when I think about the term radical fiction, and really rooting in Angela Davis's definition of radical, where she says it's the Latin means to get to the root of things. And I think to me that is what is so powerful, is that storytelling allows us to get to the root of things and allows us to touch the core of readers and touch the core of issues. And so those are just kind of things that were going through my mind. But, absolutely Octavia E. Butler, I feel like she cannot be lifted up enough. Tananarive's amazing shirt, bringing her here with us. We named our anthology Octavia's Brood in honor of her. I think for me, it was really where I saw not only representation of, Black women, working class Black women with disability issues and on all of these intersections, but where I really saw a different relationship to power. And I think that to me is what is so important about radical fiction, is that if we are actually authentically centering marginalized voices, folks of colors, communities of color, then we have to center a different way to be in power and to share power and to manifest societies. Because otherwise, if we're just replicating the same dominant narrative, we're not telling actual brown and Black stories. We're telling Black and brown stories run through white supremacist filter. And it's hard because that's what we've all grown up with. I definitely, my first novel at 11 was about elves and hobbits and ogres, and the main character was a little blonde white girl. I'm like, where did she come from? And I'm like, oh, the books told me. But I think for me, for radical fiction, I went looking for Blackness, and I found inherent in that radicalness, as Tananarive was talking about. So as I searched out where are people who have stories like mine, I found different ways of knowing the world, different ways of being in the world, and different ways of imagining the world. And, you know, whether that was Octavia E. Butler and science fiction collections like Dark Matter, or Tananarive Dew's work, in fact, herself, sitting here, which is always weird to reference one of your heroes. You're like right there in the box below me. So, you know, or it was Toni Morrison or James Baldwin's work, looking for Blackness that reflected my experience and many other Black experiences, meant finding radicalness and contending with that, and really saying, how do I want to be in this world? And if I truly want to be my full, authentic, you know, Black self in all of its creation, then I have to root in a radical vision of the present, and most importantly, the future.
Thank you. You actually did a beautiful bridge to the next question, which is, why is radical fiction important? And a lot of you have touched on that. I want to bring up one more author, which for me is a young genderqueer, queer, and non-binary person, even though I didn't have that language yet. Storm Constantine's Wraithu books were really important to me, because it was science fiction that busted out gender and what gender could be. So I wanted to bring that up. So some things that have gotten mentioned are, of course, challenging systems of power, challenging white supremacy, inclusion, and making space in between. So I'm wondering if anyone else has any more thoughts about why radical fiction is important to you, or is important in the world today. And just raise a hand and you can go.
Well, I think if we kind of like dovetail off of what Tananarive was saying a little while ago about just the very fact of writing about an identity that isn't the cishet white hegemony, and that itself is an act of radical activism in a way. I think about the children. You know, I mainly write for teens and children, although I do have books for adults here and there. And when I think about the importance of radical fiction to their lives, to the lives of children from communities of color, especially like the Chicano kids, the Latinx kids that I'm principally writing for, this type of radical fiction is important for them to see themselves as human in a world that is constantly showing them as something other. And when I think about what happened to me, not really reading any writing by Chicanos until I got to college and read Sandra Cisneros and the kind of like journey of self-discovery that set me off on, and the rabbit hole I went down for 20 years, and I came out the other side having like really begun to decentralize like the European white part of my ancestry, and to recenter my identity around indigeneity and so forth. Like kids need the tools to be able to grapple with those things within themselves, and to be told that it's okay to do that, for them to have role models. I mean, if one of the things I teach at a university, and I prepare English majors who want to become teachers to use literature that centers the students that they have in the classroom, and that will be responsive to their individual needs. And one of the things that I always emphasize to them is, if we want young people to see themselves as readers and writers and historians and intellectuals and just like thinkers in a pluralist society, then we have to give them examples of people from their own culture, from their own ethnicity, from their own gender, or orientation, that have done those very things that we want them to do. I think it's just so important. And it's also important for the imagination, as I was saying before, to be able to see, to dream yourself into being in the future, and to dream yourself into a space that perhaps doesn't really exist right now, but that we're fighting to carve out. And I think that's why speculative fiction is especially important. Radical speculative fiction that centers these often, marginalized identities, to use a term I really don't like. I think that is just vital. On average, 3,500 books are published every year for children. To think specifically about Latinx children, about 200 of those are centered on Latinx identities, and only about 100 of those are written by Latinx authors. And the case is worse for Black books from Black children written by Black authors. The percentage is even lower. It's like 35% of them. The rest are being written by white people who have jumped on this bandwagon. They feel like, oh yeah, I'm going to write about children of color. So having that own voices, authenticity is extremely important, and it's very radical right now. It's one of the reasons that the fight that we've been engaged with the group Dignidad Literaria that I helped found, pushing back against Macmillan and Flatiron and the publication of American Dirt and these things, is so vital, because if we don't demand from the publishing industry that they open a space up to these voices that right now are radical just because they're underrepresented, and they're not the default, then who is going to demand that? We have to be the ones to advocate for it. And I think that that's one of the principal, in terms of activism, things that I want to be engaged in right now.
So I'll jump in. I'm a creature of habit. So I followed you the first time, so I'll follow you again. But there are two things that work in terms of the importance of radical voices. I mean, one is obviously the pushback, opening eyes, changing minds through that prism of speculation that enables us to see reality more clearly. Someone like Derek Bell, with his short story, The Space Traders, which on the one hand, the late Derek Bell, considered a radical at Harvard Law School, wrote it's a teaching story. It's about theories of critical race theory and interest convergence theory and the history of the United States, but it's all playing out as a science fiction story, posing the question, what would happen if aliens came to the United States and offered technology and riches to the United States if the US will send all of its Blacks away? And what would happen? And we know what would happen, number one. So there's no real twist at the ending, but it's a good way to sort of walk us through this fictional premise, what we are facing in reality. But the second thing is something Margaret mentioned about Parable of the Sower, which is giving us hope. So there's pushing back against, illuminating, fighting, conflict through art, but also giving us hope that it is possible to enact change, and I think that's what a lot of us as artists are hoping will happen. And Walidah mentioned Angela Davis, so I just wanted to mention a quote. I was at a conference just a couple years ago where she was present, and I asked her, we were talking about Afrofuturism at the conference, and I asked her how she keeps her sunny disposition. Anyone who has met Dr. Angela Davis knows that she brings this sort of light with her personality, and considering what she has been through and what she can see, more importantly, because I tell my students being radical is just paying attention, and she's always paying attention. So how do you pay attention and not lose it, right? So I'm going to read what she said. It's a quote. It said, "It's not that I'm optimistic because I see the world through rose-colored glasses. It said, if the work that you've done for so many decades and years would make a difference in the future, we have to be able to imagine a different future, even though there are no guarantees. But in order to do the work we do, however we do it, whether as artists or activists, we have to believe a different kind of world is possible." And that is the job of and that's the end of the quote, but that is the job of the radical imagination, to not just critique this world that we are in that has so many issues, but also to create protagonists who are capable of bringing about change, who light the way for others to do so in real life.
That Davis quote reminds me of activist and abolitionist Mariam Kaba always says, hope is a discipline. And that circles right back into that. Margaret, did you, or Gabino?
Yeah, I completely agree with Angela Davis about this, which probably doesn't surprise too many people. I like thinking about, I come from an activist background more than I come from like a specifically fiction background, although I'm a professional fiction writer. And so I think about things I was like, when I first started trying to become a fiction writer, I was like, what am I doing? How is this helpful? And which is sort of from an artistic point of view, maybe the wrong question to ask, but whatever, it's what I asked. And I asked a bunch of really smart authors, what is the point of all of this? And one of my favorite answers is that this idea that fiction is about asking questions instead of providing answers. And that's like one of the specific advantages that fiction has as a medium to help shape the world, because the world is full of answers and all the answers are wrong, probably. But fiction instead helps us ask the right questions, because we have to collectively create the answers. There is no set of answers that was written 100 years ago or whatever that we know to be true, or we would have done it. I'm down to try the parable of the sower method, don't get me wrong. But so fiction is really good for questions. And then the other thing that I think fiction is good for is from a very practical point of view, I think fiction is how we shape political change, how we shape cultural change. Culture is how we shape political change. Like, you have to be able to imagine something in order to try and enact it. I mean, we can watch this with science fiction and technology. Scientists literally try and create the things that they've read about in books. But we also have to do that as revolutionaries or as people interested in, let's say, dramatic social change. We have to be able to present different ideas, but also culture is a very slow way to change things. Culture is it's the long game. It's I write about people who don't treat each other like shit, and I write about people who question the social capital games they play, and I write about people who try and create non-oppressive systems, because I want people to see themselves in those characters and try and do those things themselves. But the culture is not the actual change. Like, changing culture doesn't do anything. My personal feeling about why the world, at least in the US, has gone so far right so fast is because I think we were being very effective at cultural change. I think that progressives and leftists and radicals and people who in a general sense I agree with or whatever, have been very good at shaping cultural change. And we see so many more of ourselves in media, and we see people interacting with each other so much better in media. And I think that scares the right wing. And so they played to their base as hard and as fast as they could, which is racism and nationalism, and going as hard as they could. Yeah, which actually makes it sound like we did whatever. It's still worth doing, even if they fight back, you know? They're always going to fight back.
Gabino?
I was just thinking it's beautiful to be amongst your people, because I always heard when I started writing, don't get too political, because then you don't sell books. And I was like, watch me. And then being around people like that makes me happy. You folks have nailed it. You said basically everything. For me, you take a book that you consider radical. It's a magical multi-tool. I teach, and then teachers bring me their syllabi, and I love not only giving it back and say with a smile, decolonize your syllabus, but also saying for each book that you pull out, I have something to offer you, have something new to show you, something you can fill in that gap. It's about education, it's about representation, it's about diversity, it's about understanding the fact that I was a kid and I knew that I met people who were the bad folks in the books that I was reading, and then growing up and reading and understanding and getting educated, and then realizing none of the individuals that I was reading at the time understood the psychogeography of crime fiction. It's just bad guys because they're bad guys. Have you faced eviction? Have you been hungry? Let me show you how you need to understand criminals before you make a judgment. Let me teach you about how to write about criminals who are good people trying to feed their kids. So yes, we can entertain. We can give people a better chance at becoming more educated than a movie, or just titillate with fiction and imagine a better future. But at the same time, it's this magical tool where it shapes political discourse, and it gives individuals. I also teach high school. Besides teaching MFA, I teach high school. And yes, let's read Whitman. Let's read it. But then you're a 15, 16-year-old Latinx kid coming out to your parents. Let me find you a poet that addresses this. Let me show you that there are books out there that will talk about your experience, that will make you feel like there's a community out there of queer poets who understand what you've gone through. You're not alone. You want to write about these things, you feel like it's impossible. It's not impossible. You can get them out there. You can find people exactly like you. You can find reviewers who are nothing like you because they're not coming out to their parents, and they love your work, and they will interview you, and they will give you a platform. And that's how you build change. That's how you start teaching people about each other. So yeah, it's this magical multi-tool, and we all use it in different ways every single day. And just to have it, and yes, it's a country that's gone right way too quickly and way too ugly. But I'm thankful every morning for living in a country where I can use that tool in any way that I see fit, without fearing for my life. So, yeah.
Thank you. Walidah, did you have anything to add? You kind of started us off with this.
Yeah, I mean, I had a few thoughts. I mean, I think just even thinking about the term radical also to me is about just being conscious of the politics that I perpetuate in my work and being responsible for them. I think that, the reality is, and I know all of us know this, but everything is political. Every piece of art is political. Every piece of writing is political. We're the ones who are told, don't be political, because our politics are in opposition to the status quo, which is obviously political every single day. It's literally life and death, as we see every minute of every day, and definitely during this current situation. So for me, I think, calling things radical is not about, infusing politics into something because politics is already infused. It's taking responsibility for what you are creating and saying that I want this to do something in the world. And again, everything will do something in the world. So, I think it's best to be clear and to claim what you want to move in the world when we're talking about radical fiction. And then, the other piece I just want to highlight, which for, me and through my work with Octavia's Brood and what I call visionary fiction, radical sci-fi, or radical imaginings that allow us to build better worlds, is really the necessity of giving folks concrete visions to respond to. I think, in the left, we have been very good, I think, for the most part, at critique and analysis, which is absolutely vital and important. And we have to be creating spaces that say, it's not enough to just critique the prison industrial complex. What does a world without prisons look like? And we don't have to be responsible for giving the entire answer, but we are responsible for presenting something that allows folks to tangibly engage with that future, because otherwise it's just a fantasy. Because we have all been told our entire lives, these systems of power are immutable and unchanging. You cannot exist without prisons. You cannot exist without borders. You cannot exist without these things. And it's not enough then to say, yes, we can, because people are like, okay, what does that mean? Then, I think part of radical fiction is, and that can be, folks, humanizing those who have been dehumanized, as Gabino talked about, when we're talking about who is criminalized, showing folks as human who have been purposely turned into things and threats is incredibly radical, and that's part of radical fiction. But the area that I focus on is about saying, here's what a world without prisons might look like. And someone could read it and be like, this is complete crap. But you know what would be dope is this. And I'm like, that's great. Like, throw mine out. You know, mine is just a starting place. But when you give folks something concrete to react to, then they begin to move along that path and bring their own genius and ingenuity. And, you know, in for us with Octavia's Brood, then we come together, we bring all of our ingenuity, and then, you know, we do the simple act of changing the world. No biggie.
Thank you for that. I'm reminded that for the ancient Greeks, reality began in the imagination. Imagination was the starting point for everything. It wasn't this fake thing that we often think of it as. It was actually the most real thing possible. And so that's what I hear you reflecting, is that to create this reality, we start in the imagination and offer that gift. So I want to wrap a few threads together. You know, Margaret was talking about culture change being a long game. A couple others of you have mentioned changing a life today, you know, changing a kid or a teen's life because they finally see themselves and see what's possible. And that changes the future. And so I'm wondering, between this, what's often an immediate crisis we're facing, and we're certainly in the midst of yet another massive crisis right now, and this long game, this long-term vision, where do you, as both authors, artists, and teachers, how do you bring those two things together, or how do you grapple with that, with the long game and immediacy? Whoever wants to start is fine.
Well, I think the first thing that I do is in understanding that one of the biggest problems is just the underrepresentation of our communities of color and other communities, that the hegemonic, you know, white, abled, cishet kind of mentality has shoved aside for centuries. We just need to create a lot of content. There's one of the biggest efforts that we've been engaged in over the past 40, 50 years is creating content and trying to work to chip away at the barriers, the gatekeepers that prevent that content from getting out to people, or creating like new channels. And so, you know, indie publishing, Gabino and I both been published by Broken River Books, and there are tons of other really, really great indie publishers that all of you are familiar with, are such vital sources for this. That's the kind of work that has to be done in order to get to the long-term, like radical vision of you know, changing the canon completely, like not just the literary canon that's, you know, taught in classrooms, but the, you know, the speculative fiction canon and so forth, so that you don't have time and time and again people, you know, when they think of science fiction, immediately going Asimov, Heinlein, and so you know the typical thing. So the work that I personally do is, like, I see it as my responsibility as a Chicano who writes mainly speculative fiction to just create a lot of content and make sure that all my content is centered on my identity as a Chicano on the borderlands, the roots of borderland culture in Mexico and Mexico's roots in Mesoamerica, so that I am like drawing from those deep wells, the deeply rooted identity of my community, and using the tools of speculative fiction and other types of modern genres to create stories that echo the stories of my ancestors, but that also serve as a way to delight and open the minds of people who are accustomed to the same thing that all of us were accustomed to at one point, which is reading what the market pushes out. And so, like, kind of, you know, using the tools of the marketplace, using the tropes of particular types of literature to kind of like undermine those very tropes and undermine the marketplace in these really, you know, kind of subversive and radical ways, I think is it lays the groundwork. So it's doing that kind of radical work and doing it in quantities and through as many, and people, sometimes I feel like people are a little maybe irritated or taken aback by how prolific I can be. I have like 7 books coming out this year, for example, translations and books for different age groups and so forth. But there's just like the other day I was talking to Daniel Jose Older, and we were, kind of bemoaning the underrepresentation, and basically we realized that all of us could write 10 books a year for the next 100 years, and we still wouldn't completely close the gap that exists. So that creative work alongside our activism is what's really going to begin to turn the tide, in my opinion.
I'm so jealous that you can write so many books a year. I just finished my first, it took me 7 years to write the book I just finished writing. It's called The Reformatory. And but before I talk more about that, I do want to go back to the question about sort of the long-term versus the short-term, because that has a lot to do with my role as a teacher. I also teach now. I teach at UCLA. I've taught writing at Antioch University, Los Angeles, and Santa Barbara, rather. And what I found, that the old adage is true: when you start teaching, you write less, and that's a little bit of why it took me 7 years to finish this book, but not the whole story. The part of it that is that story, though, is the joy I have as a teacher when I encounter students from all these different backgrounds who are seeing a spark and seeing the work that they're doing and having input in the work they're doing actually does scratch my own creative itches in a way that made it seem less urgent to go home and work on my novel. So I will say that piece, it's not that, oh, I'm so tired, I don't feel like writing. It's I'm so full, I don't feel like writing. You know what I mean? But on the other hand, the real reason it took me 7 years to finish this novel, it's called The Reformatory. It's about a child, 12-year-old boy, who is sent to a reformatory in Jim Crow, Florida in 1950, based on the Dozier School for Boys. If you've read the Nickel Boys, that's the same institution. So I've been working on this book for a long time, and there were a lot of reasons I wanted to put it aside over those years. It was a difficult place to be, space to be, character to be, any excuse. Oh yeah, I'll write a short story for you. Oh yeah, I'll work on this script. I'll grade these papers. Any excuse I could have to move away. But what compelled me to finish it ultimately was every new time I saw Tamir Rice's face, or Trayvon Martin's face, or Sandra Bland's face, all these new hashtags and stories, because although my novel is set in the past, it is very much an indictment, especially of our so-called juvenile justice system, and why are we locking up children is a question I don't understand. And so even though it is a historical, the urgency of the now, and also hopefully reaching future generations, I've learned how quickly 20 years will fly by, and I've also learned that no single work has the automatic impact you hope it will have. So your job as the creator is to plant the seed and then keep on moving down the row and plant the next seed, right? It's not, the world is going to change I'll be on the New York Times bestselling. Yeah, none of that. It has to be about what compels you to write. And everything I write is infused to a degree with aspects of history. I wrote about an African immortal and that kind of thing. So history and the future and the present, they're all in space together. They're all a part of the same matrix. So yeah, the now is the same as the long term in a lot of ways. And it's just a matter of trying to plant those seeds, whether it's with my students or my own individual work.
Yeah, the teaching thing makes me think about a lot, because one of the first, well, okay, so everything feels really urgent to me right now, and has pretty much since the end of 2016 for some strange reason. And I write less fiction than I did. I feel that we should always use the tools that are most appropriate to us. And I think fiction is a perfectly appropriate tool. But for me, it's such a slow way of affecting culture, because it takes, let's say you take a year to write a book. Okay. And then you take a year for that book to sell, and a year for that book to get published. And then you're also talking about years before, books that I had come out in 2014 are starting to have more of a cultural impact now, years later. And I'm too impatient. So as an artist, like for example, music is much more dramatically, immediately influential. One can go to a show, except for right now. Normally one can go to a show and feel that act of cultural creation. The spells that you cast, music is a faster casting time. And books are a ritual spell. They take a lot longer. And I still write books, and I have a book that my agent's trying to sell, and I have another book that I'm about halfway through that is way behind deadline. And hopefully the editor of that isn't just hear me say I'm only halfway through. And but I focus on some other stuff right now. And then the other thing, when you're talking about teaching, I was really thinking about that, because I'm not a teacher in a proper sense. But when I was thinking about how in these times, when things are urgent, how do you make short-term change as an author? And I think about using the tools that I understand as an author for things that aren't my own writing. And I'm no longer a direct action activist to any appreciable degree, but my friends are. And so I try and help them. And I try and help them by using my platform to support them. I try and help them by editing their writing, because I have it's one of my specializations. So I can help them say, they'll say, how do I get this idea across? And I can say, well, you can try this. And that is super important to me, because I think that I often like put down my own arts, not just my own writing, but the whole mediums. And when I think about the people changing the world, I think about prison rebels, and I think about people in prison right now, especially. It's always been a nightmare, but it's such a nightmare right now. And there are people rebelling, and it's really hard to hear their voices. And I don't do enough of this. And so I'm actually trying to do it right now by being on this live streaming thing, to say that we should be listening to prison rebels right now more than ever, and listening to what's happening within prisons, but also just finding people who are doing direct action to help make the world better and supporting them. And for example, if writing is a really good way for you to make money, then it's a really good way to make money to donate to mutual aid organizations, or directly to communities that are more directly affected by COVID than you might be. Or if you're remarkably directly affected, then donate to yourself. Getting through this and surviving is crucial. And I think that can sometimes take importance over art. And I really don't mean to be totally dismissive of art. And I think it matters a lot. And clearly I spend all my time thinking about it. But yeah, that's how I feel about it.
Gabino, did you have anything you want to add?
There we go. I was unmuting myself. I learned to think of what I do as sort of trying to turn on the light. So if I have a young kid, I teach several different classes because I'm insane. So I teach an intro to journalism class right now. Try to explain to them what's fake news. I teach ethnic studies because nobody was willing to teach it. And I said, you can't let ethnic studies die in a school that's 90% Hispanic and 10% African American. You cannot do that. I'll teach it. I'll take 4 classes on and I'll teach ethnic studies. So it's a turning on of a light. It's like, let's talk about what's going on in your life. Let me show you people who've gone through this. Let me show you books that might show you ways to navigate your reality right now. At the MFA level, I have students who's like, I'm a 40-year-old woman now. I'm starting my writing career, and I've studied YA, and I know how to make it work. Except, I'm a lesbian from Appalachia, and I can't put that into my writing because that's not part of what I'm supposed to do. It's not part of the formula. So it's sort of a turning on of the light and saying, you don't have to respect the formula. You have to know it, but then you can break all the rules, because genre rules are just self-imposed constraints. You don't have to do what they tell you to do. So when I wake up and I have a good day, I see it as this enlightening role that I must do, at least with one person every chance that I get, to feel that I'm making a change. With my fiction, there's things that I'm angry about. I can go outside and scream. My neighbors are going to report me, so I'll just put it into a book, get it out of my system that way. When I wake up and I'm having a bad day, or I make the mistake of checking Twitter before breakfast, and I just get angry, then I see it as it's a war, and I'm putting people on our side. With a very fine language and a very smart discourse, you can say, "Hey, listen, you can join the idiots, or you can come to the good side. Read this stuff and make up your mind." And that's basically what education is for me. It's like either showing you the way, turning on the light, or recruiting you for the war, and that gets me through the day.
Again, I'm like, yes, everything, everyone, much brilliance. I mean, I think kind of going back to the original question, Thorn, of like the idea of the sort of immediate impact and long-term, you know, my co-editor for Octavia's Brood, Adrienne Marie Brown, is incredibly brilliant, and she does work around emergent strategy, which I will not try and explain in detail right now, but she has an amazing book called Emergent Strategy. I'd encourage everyone to read it for your life and for the future. But one of the principles of emergent strategy is for our movements is growing possibilities, growing entry points. So, you know, during workshops, and that's one of the things we did with Octavia's Brood, was to create workshops that we facilitated around the world in hundreds of communities to try and create spaces for us to collectively practice dreaming and visioning together, because there aren't enough spaces for that in this world, where we can just throw out everything we're told is possible and realistic and start with the question, what world do you want to build? And do that together. It's one thing to sort of do that as an author by yourself with your laptop or your paper and pen or quill, whatever you use. But it's another thing to do it collectively. And, you know, all real substantive social change is collective. So in those workshops, Adrienne really challenges folks to say, how do we say yes and rather than no but? How do we create more opportunities, more possibilities, more entry points? I think one of the things that our movements have sort of internalized from white supremacist heteropatriarchal capitalism is hierarchy, and the notion that there can only be one winner, one right way. And so we spend a lot of time saying our plan is the plan that will lead us to, you know, to freedom or liberation or whatever. And then we spend a lot of time saying, well, I don't think that's right because of this, rather than saying like, great, your plan sounds great, your plan sounds great, your plan sounds great, let's do all of them. Because I think we, you know, another false notion of this oppressive system is scarcity, right? This notion that there is not enough of anything. And that's a lie. There's enough food on this planet, there's enough space on this planet, there's enough everything on this planet if we didn't have capitalism and people who were hoarding more than 90% of all of that. So the same is true in our movements. There is no scarcity. It actually, it's like a perpetual motion machine, because if we create more entry points, folks who didn't see themselves represented before will enter in and bring their energy. And so the more entry points we have, the more energy we have, and the larger our movements become. So that's just, you know, to say, I think in terms of your question, it's yes, and everything else. You know, we live in a quantum universe. We have to build quantum movements for liberation. We have to recognize everything is possible. And the limits are really just what has been placed on our imagination. And once we break that, then we can build anything, and we can have as many places and ways to be in this movement and in these futures as there are people, as long as we have a shared vision and shared principles of how we want to be with each other, then we can all find a space here. And I think, you know, for me, really rooting in history, like Tananarive was talking about, is so important, and seeing that, you know, we have changed the world again and again. Oppressed peoples of color, marginalized folks. I also don't like that word, David, but, you know, those folks who have been told we have no place but at the bottom have woken up and changed the world more times than we can count. And we are doing it right now, as Margaret talked about, with folks who are incarcerated, being incredible, brilliant leaders, changing the world for themselves and for us. They're not fighting for themselves, they're fighting for all of us. And we are, everyone who is working in this moment of crisis, in every moment of crisis, and all moments which are in crisis under capitalism, is doing that every single day. We are re-envisioning the world. And we have the history behind us, pushing us, saying, you can do this because we did this. Countless of us have done this. And the future is like, come on now, keep coming towards us, keep walking, you're almost there. So, you know, I think it really is a yes and to me, that feels much more empowering and much more powerful to imagine that way, because then all we have to bring is what we have, because everyone else is bringing what they have, and we know it'll be more than enough.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any thoughts you want to share about?
I don't know, I could follow that.
Yeah.
I'm good.
Yeah, I know. That feels like a good closing to me, but I want to leave space for any other last thoughts.
No, that was great. Actually, that was perfect.
Walidah, I loved everything you just said, and it's really galvanizing and inspiring, and it makes me want to start to think about fiction as mutual aid, you know, fiction as a thing, as a tool. You know, Gabino kept talking about it as a multi-tool for liberation and mutuality. And I think that's what I'd like to leave us with. So thank you all so much for joining me today and for answering my Twitter call to come and talk about fiction and the radical imagination. And thanks to everyone who showed up to watch and listen today. And may we all be well in these times, and may we keep on imagining a wonderful, beautiful, equitable, more just world. Thanks.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.